I'd found my son sitting on a damp park bench staring blankly at the municipal pond. His 6-year-old son, my grandson Leo, was fast asleep on a pile of expensive designer luggage. I parked my rusted Ford truck, walked over, and asked why he was not at his corporate office. Matthew looked up with red eyes and told me he had just been fired. His billionaire father-in-law threw him out, announcing to the entire executive board that our mechanic bloodline was too dirty to lead their legacy. I did not scream. I did not curse the man who ruined my son. I simply smiled, picked up my sleeping grandson, and told Matthew to get in my truck. It was time his father-in-law found out who actually owned the ground he walked on. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled a billionaire in less than 48 hours, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe arrogant people always get what they deserve. The Tuesday morning air in Chicago was biting cold, the kind of damp chill that settles deep into your joints and makes your bones ache. I was supposed to be spending my morning entirely alone, buried under the hood of a classic Mustang in my drafty suburban garage. That was the life I projected to the world. A quiet, retired mechanic living on a modest pension. Instead, I was staring through the cracked windshield of my 2004 Ford F-150, watching my only child fall apart in public. The municipal park was mostly empty, save for a few aggressive pigeons fighting over a discarded piece of bread near the frozen water of the duck pond. And there was Matthew. He was wearing a custom-tailored $3,000 Italian wool suit that I knew his wife had meticulously picked out for him to fit her country club aesthetic. It was wrinkled now, the jacket thrown carelessly over the back of the peeling green paint of the wooden park bench. His silk tie was completely undone, hanging loosely around his neck like a rope he had just barely managed to slip out of. At his feet sat 4 massive pieces of Louis Vuitton luggage. The sleek, obnoxious monogrammed leather looked utterly ridiculous sitting there on the bird-stained concrete. And curled up on top of the largest suitcase, wrapped tightly in Matthew's heavy cashmere trench coat, was Leo. My beautiful grandson was sleeping soundly, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, completely unaware that his entire world had just been detonated by the people who were supposed to protect him. I killed the engine of my truck. The old motor sputtered and died with a heavy metallic clank that echoed sharply across the empty park. Matthew did not even flinch at the noise. He did not turn his head. He just kept staring out at the murky water, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. I stepped out of the cab, my heavy steel-toed work boots crunching against the loose gravel path. I took my time walking toward him. You can learn a tremendous amount about a man's breaking point simply by observing how he holds his silence. Matthew was hunched over, his elbows resting heavily on his knees, his hands buried deep in his dark hair. He looked 10 years older than 34. The stress of trying to fit into a world that secretly despised him had carved deep lines around his eyes. When I finally reached the bench, I did not ask him if he was okay. It was a foolish question for a foolish time. I just stood next to him, letting my tall shadow fall over the expensive mountain of luggage. I placed a calloused, grease-stained hand on his shoulder. I felt the fine, expensive wool of his suit jacket, and underneath it, the rigid, vibrating tension of a man who was desperately trying not to shatter into a million jagged pieces, right there in the cold morning air. Matthew finally looked up at me. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, the red veins spiderwebbing across the whites of his eyes in a map of pure exhaustion. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking violently in his throat. "I lost it. I lost absolutely everything." I sat down heavily beside him on the freezing wooden slats of the bench, ignoring the cold seeping through my worn denim jeans. "Start from the beginning," I instructed him, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of panic. "Do not skip a single detail. Tell me exactly what happened." Matthew took a deep, shuddering breath, staring down at his expensive leather shoes. It was the quarterly executive review at Pierce Manufacturing. I was supposed to be presenting the revised supply chain logistics for the new fiscal year. I had spent 3 weeks on that presentation, Dad. I slept on the sofa in my office trying to optimize their shipping routes to save the company millions in overhead. The entire board of directors was gathered in the main conference room. All the heavy hitters, the investors, the senior vice presidents. Carlton walked in 20 minutes late, making everyone wait in silence just to prove he held the power. He did not even bother to sit down at his chair. He just stood at the head of the long mahogany conference table, poured himself a glass of sparkling water, and let me talk for about 5 agonizing minutes. Then he raised his hand. Not to ask a financial question. He raised it like you would to silence a disobedient dog. Matthew swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically as he relived the nightmare. He told me to turn off the projector screen. He looked around at his wealthy friends and announced that he was tired of listening to a peasant try to explain complex mathematics to kings. I felt a cold, hard knot begin to form in the deep pit of my stomach, but I kept my face entirely blank. Tell me exactly what Carlton said, I urged him gently. Word for word. I need to know his exact phrasing. Matthew closed his eyes, the memory clearly burning him from the inside out. He laughed, Dad. It was this dry, echoing laugh that filled the room. Then he pointed a finger right at my chest and said, Gentlemen, I apologize for wasting your valuable morning. We are terminating Matthew's employment effectively immediately. When I asked him why, when I practically begged him in front of everyone to explain what metric I had failed to meet, Carlton just gave me that terrible, cold smile of his. He told me that my work performance was irrelevant. He said that putting a man with my specific pedigree in a corner office was like putting a lawnmower engine inside a Ferrari. He called me a mechanic's son. He said that dirt, grease, and poverty were permanently baked into my bloodline, and that a bloodline like mine was simply not worthy of managing the pristine Pierce family legacy. The board members just sat there in their tailored suits. Some of them looked down at their legal pads. A few of the older executives actually smirked. Nobody said a single word in my defense. Not one person. He stripped me of my dignity, my career, and my pride in front of 40 powerful people. Then he told the building security to escort me out of the boardroom like I was a common thief caught stealing office supplies. They made me hand over my keycard, my company laptop, and my corporate phone right there in the hallway, while the summer interns stood by the water cooler and watched. I sat there on the park bench and listened to every single word my son said. I pictured Carlton Pierce standing in his custom-tailored suit, bloated with unearned arrogance, systematically tearing down my son just to inflate his own fragile ego. Carlton was a man who had inherited a massive manufacturing factory from his grandfather and acted as if he had personally invented the concept of industry itself. He thought his inherited money made him untouchable. He thought my son was weak simply because my son chose to be kind and hardworking. I let Matthew finish his humiliating description of the long walk of shame to the glass elevators, the agonizing ride down to the main lobby accompanied by 2 burly armed security guards. I let him purge all the toxic poison from his system. The anger building inside my chest was not hot. Hot anger makes a man stupid. Hot anger makes you yell, throw punches, and make fatal tactical mistakes. My anger was absolute zero. It was the kind of chilling cold that crystallizes your focus until you can see the exact, precise weak point in your enemy's armor. But why are you sitting at a public park with Leo? I asked, gesturing toward the sleeping boy and the ridiculous mountain of designer luggage. If you got fired at the corporate office, why did you not just drive straight home to your house? Matthew let out a harsh sound that was half sob and half bitter laugh. Home? Dad, I do not have a home anymore. When the security guards finally escorted me down into the grand glass lobby of the Pierce building, Rachel was already waiting for me. My own wife was standing next to the marble reception desk. She had Leo by the hand, and these 4 packed bags were stacked neatly on a brass luggage cart beside her. I thought she was there to support me. I actually thought she had heard the news and rushed down to be by my side. I ran toward her. I was ready to hold her, to tell her that we would figure it out, that I would easily find another executive job. But when I reached out to hug her, she held up her manicured hand and physically pushed my chest to stop me from touching her. Matthew wiped a stray tear from his cheek with the rough back of his hand. She looked at me like I was a diseased stranger who had just asked her for spare change on the subway. She handed me the metal handles of the luggage cart. She told me she had personally packed my belongings. She looked me dead in the eye and said her father was entirely right about me. She called me a sinking ship and declared that she refused to drown in mediocrity with me. She told me she was filing for divorce first thing tomorrow morning and seeking full physical and legal custody of Leo. She said a jobless mechanic's son living in the suburbs could never provide the elite lifestyle a true Pierce child required. I asked her what she was talking about, Dad. I pleaded with her. I told her we have been married for 7 years. We built a beautiful life together. And she just looked at me with this dead, empty, terrifying expression. She told me her father had already arranged a private dinner for her tonight at the country club with a wealthy venture capitalist from New York. A man who can actually inject capital into the Pierce empire to save it from bankruptcy. Carlton is forcing her to marry new money to save his struggling, poorly managed company, and she is going right along with it without a second thought. She shoved Leo toward me, handed me the bags, turned around on her expensive heels, and walked back into the private corporate elevator without looking back once. She threw me away, Dad. She threw her own loyal husband away like garbage because her father commanded her to. I looked down at my sweet grandson, still sleeping peacefully on the cold, monogrammed leather, completely oblivious to the horrific fact that his mother had just traded his father for a corporate financial bailout. I looked at my grown son, a fundamentally good, honest man who had been systematically broken and discarded by a family of greedy, soulless parasites. Carlton Pierce honestly believed he had just executed a flawless, unopposed victory. He believed he had successfully excised a blue-collar tumor from his pristine, wealthy family tree and tossed the trash out onto the curb where it belonged. He truly believed I was just an uneducated, tired old man with permanent engine dirt under his fingernails, who would quietly accept the pathetic crumbs of his cruelty and fade away into poverty. He had absolutely no idea what kind of monster he had just awakened from a 30-year slumber. I did not raise my voice in the quiet park. I did not curse Rachel's name or threaten to drive my truck straight through the glass doors of the Pierce building to break Carlton's jaw. Retaliation is a delicate dish best served with absolute, crushing legal precision, not sloppy brute force. I leaned over the heavy suitcases and gently scooped Leo into my arms. The boy stirred slightly, burying his warm face deep into the collar of my worn flannel jacket, taking comfort in the familiar smell of motor oil and sawdust that always clung to me. "Grab the bags, Matthew," I said softly, turning my back on the pond. "We are leaving right now." Matthew blinked rapidly, visibly confused by my unnervingly calm demeanor. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice shaking. "We are going to my house," I replied, walking steadily toward my rusted truck. "Get in the car, son. It is time to go to work." I loaded the heavy, obnoxious designer bags into the dented metal bed of the Ford. I buckled Leo securely into the back seat, making sure he was warm and comfortable. Matthew slid numbly into the passenger seat, staring straight ahead through the dirty windshield, like a shell-shocked soldier returning from a lost war. I started the engine, aggressively shifting the old truck into gear, and pulled out of the park gravel lot onto the main road. We were exactly 3 miles down the interstate, the heavy silence inside the cab growing thicker by the second. when Matthew's cell phone began to vibrate violently against the plastic dashboard. He reached out with trembling fingers and picked it up. As he read the screen, his face instantly drained of whatever little pale color it had left. He frantically tapped the glass screen, his panicked breath catching hard in his throat. "Dad," he choked out, staring in absolute horror at his mobile banking application. "My accounts, the joint savings, the checking, the emergency fund we built for Leo, they are all completely locked. Carlton just froze every single one of my corporate credit cards, and Rachel just emptied our personal joint accounts down to the last penny. I have exactly $42.15 to my name. I am ruined." I kept my eyes focused dead ahead on the gray highway, my grip tightening slowly on the worn leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "Let them have those worthless pennies," I said quietly, the coldness in my voice surprising even myself. "They are going to need every last one of them by Friday." We walked into my small kitchen, and the screen door slapped shut behind us. I set Leo down on the faded linoleum floor and watched him run straight to the worn fabric sofa in the living room. My house was exactly as it had been for the last 2 decades. The kitchen counters were made of cheap yellow formica, and the refrigerator hummed with a loud mechanical rattle every time the compressor kicked on. The curtains above the sink were a faded plaid, washed too many times over the years. I walked over to the chipped porcelain sink, washed the grease off my hands with a bar of heavy-duty soap, and pulled a cast-iron skillet from the bottom cabinet. I grabbed 2 slices of white bread and a block of sharp cheddar cheese. I was going to make my grandson a simple grilled cheese sandwich. It was a grounding task, a quiet routine that stood in stark contrast to the absolute chaos of the morning. Meanwhile, Matthew was pacing back and forth across the narrow hallway, his expensive leather shoes squeaking sharply against the cheap flooring. He was a man trapped in a cage made of pure panic. "Dad, you do not understand the sheer magnitude of what we are dealing with here," Matthew stammered, running his trembling hands through his dark hair. He stopped pacing and leaned heavily against the peeling floral wallpaper. "Carlton Pierce is not just a wealthy man from the suburbs. He is a financial titan who eats ordinary people like us for breakfast. He owns Pierce Manufacturing, which means he employs half the town, but he also owns the politicians, the zoning boards, and half the judges in this county. He has an entire floor of corporate lawyers on retainer who bill $1,000 an hour just to make his minor inconveniences disappear completely." I struck a wooden match, turned the knob on my old gas stove, and watched the ring of blue flame ignite under the heavy iron skillet. I dropped a generous pat of butter into the pan and listened to it sizzle against the hot metal. "Keep talking," I said calmly, not taking my eyes off the melting butter. "Tell me exactly what his lawyers are going to do to you." Matthew threw his hands up in the air in absolute despair. "They are going to bury me alive, Dad. Rachel already told me in the lobby that Carlton hired the most ruthless and expensive custody attorney in the state. They will drag my name through the mud in open court. They will pull up my locked bank records showing I have absolutely zero assets to my name. They will send evaluators to take one look at this house. No offense to you, Dad. And they will tell the judge that a retired mechanic living on a fixed pension cannot possibly provide a suitable or safe environment for a Pierce family heir. They will claim I am financially unstable, emotionally volatile, and completely unfit to raise my own son. Carlton has private investigators on speed dial. He has the local media in his pocket to spin any narrative he wants. He has unlimited capital to bleed me dry in legal fees until I simply give up. We have absolutely nothing to fight him with." I placed the cheese between the bread and set it gently into the hot butter. The comforting, domestic smell of toasted bread filled the small kitchen, pushing back against the sterile, corporate terror Matthew was radiating. He was right about one thing. To the outside world, I was just an old man scraping by on Social Security. Carlton lived in a 20,000 square foot gated mansion with private security patrols. He flew on a private jet to avoid mingling with the working class at the commercial airport. He wore watches that cost more than the total value of my entire property. Matthew slumped down heavily into one of the wobbly wooden dining chairs and buried his face in his hands. "I am so deeply sorry, Dad," he whispered, his voice muffled and broken. "I worked so incredibly hard to climb out of the garage. I worked 80-hour weeks to give Rachel the luxurious life she demanded, to be the kind of successful man Carlton could finally respect and accept into his inner circle. I doubled his factory output in 3 years, and in 5 minutes, he took it all away and reminded me that I am just a dirty mechanic's son after all. I should have known better than to think I could ever sit at their table as an equal. I used a metal spatula to flip the sandwich, watching the sharp cheddar melt perfectly down the sides of the golden crust. I slid the hot food onto a ceramic plate, poured a small glass of apple juice, and carried it out to the living room, where Leo was already distracted by watching cartoons on my old box television. I patted the boy gently on his head and walked back into the kitchen. Matthew was still sitting at the table, staring blankly at the scratched wood grain. He truly believed we were completely powerless against the Pierce Empire. He believed Carlton's inherited money made him an untouchable god among men. He had absolutely no idea that true wealth does not need to scream its presence from a mountaintop, and that the most dangerous men are the ones who wear cheap denim. I wiped my hands clean on a cotton dish towel and looked down at my defeated son. "Drink a glass of water, Matthew," I instructed him quietly. "Then wait right here at this table. I have something hidden in the garage that I need to show you." I left Matthew sitting in the kitchen and walked down the narrow hallway toward the side door. I pushed open the heavy wooden door that led into my garage. The air inside was freezing and smelled strongly of stale motor oil, rusted metal, and damp concrete. To the outside observer, this was just the cluttered workspace of an old man who refused to let go of his past. The walls were lined with wooden pegboards holding greasy wrenches, worn sockets, and rusted pliers. In the center of the cold concrete floor sat a classic car I had been slowly restoring for the past 6 years. It was the perfect disguise for my life. Nobody looks twice at a retired man tinkering with a broken engine. People see exactly what they expect to see. They see a man who works with his hands and has absolutely nothing of real value to offer the modern corporate world. Carlton Pierce had looked at this garage and decided I was nothing but a peasant. I walked past the classic car and headed straight for the dark back corner of the garage. A massive steel tool cabinet stood against the cinder block wall. It weighed nearly 400 pounds when fully loaded with equipment. I grabbed the thick metal handle on the side, planted my boots firmly on the ground, and threw my entire body weight against it. The heavy rubber casters groaned in loud protest as I slowly rolled the massive cabinet away from the wall. Beneath it lay a thick, rectangular rubber mat, stained with old transmission fluid. I kicked the mat aside with my heavy boot to reveal a solid steel plate embedded flush with the concrete foundation. I knelt down on the freezing floor and wiped away a thick layer of gray dust. A solid brass combination dial stared back at me. I spun the dial with practiced precision. 4 right to 42, 3 left to 17, 2 right to 30, 1 left to 0. The heavy internal locking bolts slid back with a loud and deeply satisfying metallic clank that echoed through the quiet garage. I gripped the recessed handle and pulled the heavy steel door upward. Inside the dark fireproof cavity sat items that did not belong in a suburban garage. I bypassed the neat stacks of emergency cash and reached straight for a heavy black leather binder and a secure satellite phone. I stood up, my knees aching slightly from the cold floor, and placed the binder flat on the hood of the old car. I opened the thick leather cover. Inside were the pristine and meticulously organized corporate documents of Bennett Equities. It was a massive private holding company I had quietly incorporated over 3 decades ago. When Carlton Pierce looked at me, he saw a man with permanent dirt under his fingernails. He did not know that 30 years ago I designed and successfully patented a highly specialized high-pressure hydraulic valve. It was a piece of engineering brilliance that revolutionized industrial manufacturing by preventing catastrophic pressure failures in heavy machinery. And it was the exact same valve that Pierce Manufacturing relied on for every single one of their flagship products. Without my patented valve, their entire global assembly line would permanently freeze. I never sold the patent to the corporate vultures. I simply licensed it to them through a complex web of anonymous corporate entities and legal trusts. Carlton had been making me richer with every single machine he sold for the last 30 years, without ever realizing he was sending his money directly to the father of the man he openly despised. But the patent was not the only weapon I had buried in that concrete vault. I turned the crisp pages of the binder until I found the commercial real estate deeds. 15 years ago, Pierce Manufacturing ran into severe financial trouble due to Carlton's reckless spending habits. They were desperate for liquid cash to keep their factory doors open and avoid total bankruptcy. Carlton quietly sold the massive tract of commercial land underneath his main factory to an anonymous private equity firm just to stay afloat. He then signed an ironclad 99-year lease to rent the land back from them. He thought he was outsmarting his creditors by securing the cash without losing operational control. He was so arrogant that he never bothered to thoroughly investigate who actually owned the firm that bought his land. I looked down at the original deed bearing my legally witnessed signature. I owned the dirt beneath his flagship factory. I owned the walls around him. I owned the very ground his empire stood upon. Buried deep in that commercial lease was a strict default clause regarding municipal zoning violations. A clause I knew Carlton had been quietly ignoring for years to save money on waste disposal. He thought he could strip my son of his livelihood because of our bloodline. He thought he could steal my grandson and force his own daughter to marry for capital. He was about to find out that our dirty mechanic bloodline financed his entire pathetic existence. I picked up the secure satellite phone. It felt heavy and cold in my palm, a stark contrast to the rough wooden handles of the tools hanging on my walls. For years, I had played the role of the quiet and accommodating grandfather. I had swallowed Carlton's subtle insults at family gatherings to keep the peace for Matthew and Rachel. I had allowed them to believe their grand illusion of superiority to protect my son's happiness. But that illusion was now over. Carlton had drawn first blood when he publicly humiliated my son and threatened my family. I brushed the garage dust off my worn flannel shirt and stared at the satellite phone. The tired, retired mechanic was dead. The chief executive officer of Bennett Equities was finally awake, and I was going to systematically dismantle his entire world before the sun went down tomorrow. I stood in the freezing garage staring at the heavy satellite phone in my hand. I pressed the power button and waited for the encrypted signal to connect. It was a direct line to Stephen Gallagher. Stephen was not a local family lawyer who handled minor disputes. He was a ruthless corporate litigator based in New York City. He was the kind of man who dismantled massive corporate empires before he even finished his morning coffee. I paid his firm a staggering retainer every single year for his absolute discretion and his lethal efficiency. The phone rang exactly one time before he answered. "Good morning, George," Stephen said. His voice was crisp and completely devoid of useless pleasantries. "We do not usually speak on a Tuesday morning unless a market is crashing or a competitor is bleeding. What is our target today?" I leaned against the cold metal of my tool cabinet and looked down at the Bennett Equities binder. "The target is Carlton Pierce," I told him, keeping my tone perfectly flat and composed. "I want you to initiate a hostile financial strike against Pierce Manufacturing immediately. I want it done quietly, I want it done quickly, and I want it done without leaving a single paper trail that leads back to me." There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of Stephen typing rapidly on his mechanical keyboard. Pierce Manufacturing, Stephen repeated. They are currently leveraged to the absolute limit, George. Carlton Pierce has been bleeding his own company dry for the last 5 years just to fund his lavish personal lifestyle. They have massive short-term debt maturing in less than 30 days. He owes a consortium of private lenders nearly $40 million, and his liquid cash reserves are practically non-existent right now. They are a sinking ship. Why do you want to touch a toxic asset like that? Because he just made a fatal personal mistake, I replied. He publicly fired Matthew this morning. He insulted our family, he stripped my son of his livelihood, and he convinced his daughter to file for full custody of my grandson so she can marry a venture capitalist for bailout money. Carlton thinks he is completely untouchable because he holds all the local power in this town. I want you to show him what actual power looks like. I heard Stephen stop typing. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with predatory anticipation. He knew that when I finally decided to move against an enemy, I did not leave any survivors. What are your precise instructions? Stephen asked, his tone shifting from purely analytical to aggressively tactical. I want you to contact every single private creditor currently holding Pierce Manufacturing debt, I instructed him. Use our shadow subsidiaries. Buy up every single promissory note, every high-interest loan, and every outstanding credit line Carlton Pierce has leveraged. Offer the creditors a 10% premium on the principal to close the deals within the next 2 hours. Do not negotiate with them. Just flood them with cash and take absolute ownership of the debt. I want Bennett Equities to be the sole entity holding the financial leash around his neck by noon today. Consider it done, Stephen said firmly. But you know that simply holding his debt will not bankrupt him immediately. He still has the factory operations running. He will just attempt to refinance or find a new investor to bail him out. Let him try, I said, staring at the patented hydraulic valve schematics resting inside my open binder. We are going to cut off his oxygen supply from multiple angles. Just secure the debt first. Once we own his financial obligations, we will execute the next phase of the strategy. I want him backed into a corner so tight, he cannot even breathe without my explicit permission. I will have the wire transfers completed before your lunch hour, Stephen assured me. Should I prepare a legal team for the custody battle regarding your grandson? No, I replied coldly. Matthew will not be fighting a prolonged custody battle in family court. By the time we are finished with Carlton Pierce, his daughter will not have a single dime left to pay a lawyer, and Carlton will be begging us to take the boy just to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. Call me the exact second the debt is fully secured. I ended the call and placed the heavy phone back inside the steel vault. The first trap was officially set. Carlton Pierce was currently celebrating his perceived victory in a glass boardroom, completely unaware that a retired mechanic had just bought his entire financial existence. I stepped out of the freezing garage and walked back into the narrow hallway of my house. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the corporate war I had just ignited. I could hear the faint, cheerful music of the television cartoon playing in the living room where Leo was sitting. I took a deep breath, preparing to go back into the kitchen to check on Matthew. But before I could take another step, 3 loud, aggressive knocks hammered against my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, entitled pounding of someone who believed they already owned the property they were standing on. I walked to the front door and pulled it open. Rachel was standing on my small concrete porch. She had not bothered to change out of the expensive designer dress she wore to the corporate office earlier that morning. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her face was twisted into a mask of pure, impatient contempt. She was not alone. Standing directly behind her were 2 large men wearing cheap gray suits and dark sunglasses. They had the stiff, aggressive posture of private security or court process servers hired specifically to intimidate normal people. "Where is my son?" Rachel demanded, her voice sharp and loud enough for the neighbors to hear. She did not say hello. She did not ask for permission to enter my home. She simply stepped forward, trying to physically push past me into the hallway. I planted my heavy work boots firmly on the threshold, using my broad shoulders to completely block the doorway. "Leo is eating his lunch," I told her, my voice low and dangerously calm. "You are not coming inside my house, Rachel." She let out a harsh, mocking laugh and gestured carelessly to the two large men standing behind her. "You do not have a choice in the matter, George," she sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "I am not here to negotiate with a retired mechanic. These men have an emergency court order signed by a judge less than an hour ago. We are here to remove Leo from this unsanitary environment and take him back to the Pierce estate where he actually belongs." One of the men in the gray suits stepped forward and shoved a thick manila envelope aggressively against my chest. "You have been officially served," the man said in a bored, monotone voice. "The mother has been granted temporary emergency physical custody due to the sudden financial insolvency and suspected emotional instability of the father. Hand the boy over right now, or we will call the local police department and have you arrested for kidnapping." Matthew appeared at the end of the hallway, his face draining of all color as he saw his wife standing on the porch with legal muscle. Rachel smiled when she saw him. It was a cold, venomous smile. She thought she had him completely trapped. She thought the sight of those thick legal papers would make us both crumble into absolute panic and submission. She had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 3 decades destroying legal traps far more complex than a rushed family court filing. I looked down at the thick manila envelope pressed against my chest. The process server wearing the cheap gray suit gave me a smug look, expecting me to step aside. I did not move a single inch. I took the envelope from his hands with agonizing slowness. I deliberately broke the metal clasp and pulled out the stack of legal documents. Rachel let out an exaggerated sigh of profound annoyance. She tapped her expensive leather heel against the concrete of my porch. "Read it fast, George," she snapped at me. "I have a very important dinner reservation to get to tonight, and I am taking Leo with me right now. Go pack his things." I ignored her completely. I unfolded the thick paper and began to read the text. The silence on the porch grew incredibly heavy. I read the first page. Then I read the second page. I took my time, letting my eyes scan every single line of text, every legal citation, and every stamped seal. Matthew was standing completely frozen at the end of the hallway behind me. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing. He thought these papers were a death sentence. But as I read the third page, a cold and genuine sense of amusement washed over me. Carlton Pierce had indeed hired an expensive and ruthless family attorney. But expensive attorneys do not like to rush their paperwork. Carlton had obviously forced his lawyer to draft and file this emergency ex parte motion in less than an hour. And when arrogant men rush the legal system, they make fatal structural mistakes. I looked up from the documents and fixed my gaze directly on the first process server. I did not look at Rachel. I stripped her of her power by completely ignoring her presence. "Are you a licensed court officer or just a private contractor hired by the Pierce family?" I asked the man in the gray suit. My voice was quiet, but it carried a sharp edge of authority that made him blink in surprise. "We are licensed process servers for the county," he replied, puffing out his chest slightly. "And we are authorized to request immediate police assistance if you interfere with a court-ordered custody transfer." I nodded slowly. "Then, as a licensed officer of the court, you should probably learn how to read the documents you are aggressively shoving into the chests of private citizens." I held up the second page of the filing and pointed a calloused finger at the judge's signature block. "This is a petition for an emergency ex parte order of custody. It is completely based on the unverified sworn affidavit of the mother claiming immediate physical danger to the child. However, If you look right here at the jurisdictional stamp, you will clearly see this was filed in Family Court District 4. The process server frowned and leaned in slightly to look at the paper. Rachel crossed her arms even tighter. "What does the district matter?" she demanded sharply. "A judge signed it. Hand over my son." I continued speaking only to the man in the suit. "It matters because my home, where we are currently standing, sits exactly 1/2 mile across the county line in District 5. District 4 holds absolutely zero legal jurisdiction over this property or anyone residing inside it. This order is legally unenforceable outside of their specific municipal boundaries." The process server shifted his weight uncomfortably. He looked at his partner. Rachel's face began to flush with an ugly, blotchy red color. She stepped forward, her expensive perfume clashing with the smell of my old garage. "That is a pathetic technicality," Rachel shouted, finally losing her carefully manicured composure. "My father plays golf with the judge who signed that paper. It is a valid legal order and you are breaking the law by keeping my child hostage." I lowered the papers and finally looked Rachel directly in the eyes. The sheer panic and desperation hiding behind her anger was pathetic to witness. "It is not a technicality, Rachel. It is the law. And since we are discussing the law, let us look at the actual contents of your sworn affidavit." I flipped to the final page and read aloud. "The petitioner claims the father is severely financially insolvent and living in an unsanitary, dangerous location, thereby placing the minor child at immediate risk of bodily harm." I lowered the paper again. "You swore under penalty of perjury that this house is a dangerous environment. Yet Leo has visited this exact house every single Sunday for the last 3 years with your full and documented consent. You even sent him here with his overnight bags this morning." Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but I completely talked over her, my voice rising just enough to drown out her lies. "Furthermore, the financial insolvency you claim Matthew is suffering from was artificially created by your father less than 2 hours ago when he illegally froze Matthew's corporate accounts without proper corporate authorization. That is called financial abuse and malicious deprivation. You cannot deliberately bankrupt a man at 9 in the morning and then run to a judge at 10, claiming he is too poor to feed his son." I turned my attention back to the 2 large men standing on my porch. They no longer looked like aggressive enforcers. They looked like men who suddenly realized they had stepped into the middle of a massive legal minefield. "Gentlemen," I said, making sure my tone was perfectly calm and professional, "if you attempt to cross the threshold of my home to take my grandson based on a document that lacks basic geographical jurisdiction and is built entirely on verifiable perjury, I will not physically stop you. But I will immediately file civil charges against both of you personally for trespassing, harassment, and participating in an illegal child abduction. I will take your professional licenses, I will take your personal bonds, and I will make sure you spend the next 5 years drowning in federal court. Now, I suggest you take these worthless papers back to whatever overpaid lawyer drafted them and tell him to buy a better map." I held the stack of papers out to the man in the gray suit. He stared at the documents like they were covered in poison. He slowly reached out and took them back from my hand. He gave Rachel a deeply apologetic look. "I am sorry, Mrs. Pierce," the man muttered, taking a quick step backward toward the driveway. "He is right about the county lines. We cannot enforce a District 4 seizure order in District 5 without a local police escort, and the local police will not enforce it once they see the jurisdictional error. You have to go back to the courthouse." Rachel looked at the 2 men in absolute disbelief. "You are walking away," she shrieked, her voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "My father pays your entire firm. You get back in there and get my son right now." The second man shook his head and turned around. "We do not get paid enough to lose our licenses over a bad filing, lady. Call your lawyer." The 2 men walked rapidly down my driveway toward their unmarked sedan. eager to escape the disaster. Rachel was left standing completely alone on my porch. The massive illusion of absolute power she had walked up here with was totally shattered. She glared at me with a hatred so pure and toxic, it practically radiated from her skin. She looked past my shoulder, trying to find Matthew in the dark hallway. "You are going to regret this, Matthew," she screamed over my shoulder. "My father is going to crush you. He is going to make sure you never work in this state again. You are going to be begging me for mercy by tomorrow morning." Matthew did not say a single word. He did not have to. I took one final look at my arrogant daughter-in-law. "Make sure you are dressed appropriately for your dinner date tonight at the country club, Rachel," I told her quietly. "You are going to need all the financial help you can get." I did not wait for her to respond. I stepped back inside my home and closed the heavy front door firmly in her face. I reached up and turned the brass deadbolt until it locked with a loud click. The house was instantly silent again. The immediate physical threat to my grandson was neutralized. I turned around to face my son. He was staring at me with his mouth slightly open in complete shock. He had just watched his retired blue-collar father systematically dismantle 2 professional legal enforcers and his vicious wife using nothing but words and absolute unshakable confidence. He finally realized that the old man living in the dirty garage was not a victim. I walked past him and headed back toward the kitchen. The defense of our home was over. It was time to go on the absolute offensive. I walked back into the kitchen, where Matthew was still sitting at the yellow Formica table. He had his head buried in his hands, completely defeated by the confrontation he had just witnessed on the front porch. Before I could say a single word to him, the heavy yellow plastic landline mounted on the kitchen wall began to ring. It was a harsh, mechanical bell sound that cut sharply through the tense silence of the room. I walked over and picked up the receiver. I did not say hello. I just held the cheap plastic to my ear and waited. On the other end of the line, I could hear the faint sound of classical music playing in the background and the sharp clinking of heavy crystal glassware. Then a man cleared his throat. It was a rich, booming voice soaked in absolute entitlement. "Am I speaking to George Bennett?" the man asked. I recognized the voice immediately from the arrogant cadence. It was Carlton Pierce. "I am George," I replied, my voice completely flat. Carlton let out a short, patronizing chuckle. "George, it is Carlton Pierce. I imagine you are currently dealing with a rather hysterical situation at your little house right now. My daughter just called me in tears, claiming you harassed her process servers. I told her not to worry about it. People of your specific social class tend to get defensive and highly emotional when they are faced with the complicated realities of the legal system. I am calling you because I am a practical businessman, and I prefer to handle these messy domestic problems cleanly and efficiently without tying up my expensive lawyers in county court all week. I want to offer you a unique opportunity to walk away from this disaster with something substantial in your pocket. I am prepared to be incredibly generous today, considering the unfortunate circumstances of your son losing his job this morning." I leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at Matthew, who was staring blankly at the floor. "What exactly is your generous offer, Carlton?" I asked. Carlton took a slow sip of whatever expensive liquor he was drinking. "I am prepared to wire $50,000 directly into your personal checking account by the end of the business day," he announced with profound arrogance. $50,000 tax-free, George. Let us be brutally honest with each other. For a retired mechanic living on a fixed government pension inside a house that is barely up to municipal code, that is a completely life-changing amount of wealth. It pays off whatever pathetic mortgage you still owe. It buys you a brand new truck to replace that rusted piece of garbage sitting in your driveway. All you have to do in exchange is convince your son to sign the permanent custody relinquishment forms my corporate lawyers are drafting right now. Tell Matthew it is completely over. Tell him to pack whatever cheap clothes he has left and move out of the state immediately. Rachel is marrying a man who actually has the massive capital required to provide for my grandson. A man with a flawless pedigree and actual power. Matthew is a rapidly sinking ship, and if you care about him at all, you will take my money and buy him a one-way bus ticket far away from my family. If you refuse this incredible charity, I will personally ensure your son spends the next 10 years drowning and crushing legal debt until he is literally sleeping on the concrete street. The sheer blind arrogance of the man was almost fascinating to listen to. He genuinely believed that $50,000 was enough to buy a grandfather's soul and a father's loyalty. He thought he was playing a brilliant high-stakes game of chess against an uneducated stray dog. I let the absolute silence stretch over the phone line for 10 agonizing seconds. I wanted him to feel the heavy, crushing weight of my complete lack of fear. "Carlton," I finally said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that held absolutely no emotion. "Keep your $50,000. Put it back in your severely overdrawn corporate accounts. You are going to need every single penny of it to buy a decent criminal defense attorney very soon. You think you hold all the cards because you sit in a glass tower and spend the money your grandfather built. But you just made the biggest and most fatal miscalculation of your entire pathetic life. You do not know who I actually am. You do not know what I secretly own. And by the time the sun goes down tomorrow evening, you are going to realize that you cannot afford to buy a single blade of dead grass on my front lawn." "Are you threatening me, you old fool?" Carlton snapped, his arrogant composure finally cracking. I did not bother to answer him. I took the yellow plastic receiver and placed it gently back onto the wall hook, cutting off his furious voice entirely. I turned to face my son. I turned away from the yellow plastic wall phone and looked at my son. Matthew was still sitting at the kitchen table. He looked up at me with absolute dread in his bloodshot eyes. He assumed Carlton had just delivered the final death blow to our family. I walked over to the table and pulled out the chair opposite to him. I told Matthew that Carlton had just offered me $50,000 to convince him to walk away from his own son. Matthew let out a hollow sound and buried his face in his hands. He muttered that $50,000 was more money than I had ever seen, and that maybe we should take it to pay off my mortgage. He genuinely believed that we were completely at the mercy of a billionaire. I did not comfort him with soft words. I stood up and told him to wait right there. I walked back down the narrow hallway and stepped into the freezing garage. I walked over to the open steel floor safe. I reached inside and pulled out the thick black leather binder containing the entire corporate portfolio of Bennett equities. It was time to pull my son out of the dark. I carried the heavy binder back into the kitchen. I dropped it squarely onto the cheap yellow Formica table. The heavy thud made Matthew jump slightly in his chair. I pushed the leather-bound book across the table until it was resting directly in front of him. I told him to open it. Matthew stared at the binder like it was a live explosive. He slowly reached out with trembling fingers and flipped open the thick black cover. The very first page was the master incorporation document for Bennett Equities. He read the name at the top of the page. Then his eyes scanned down to the bottom, where my legally witnessed signature sat in bold black ink. He looked up at me in total confusion. He asked me what Bennett Equities was. I told him to turn the page. He turned the heavy parchment paper. He found the original patent documents for the high-pressure hydraulic valve. Matthew was a brilliant supply chain logistician. He knew the inner workings of Pierce manufacturing better than anyone. He recognized the technical schematics instantly. His eyes went incredibly wide. He whispered that this was the core component of the entire Pierce global assembly line. He said, without this specific valve, the factory could not legally operate for a single day. I nodded slowly. I told him that I designed that valve 30 years ago right out there in my dirty garage. I told him I never sold it to the corporate empires. I only licensed it through a massive web of anonymous trusts. I told him that every time Carlton Pierce sold a piece of heavy machinery over the last 3 decades, he was depositing money directly into my private holding company. Matthew was completely paralyzed. He could not comprehend what he was seeing. He rapidly flipped to the next section of the binder. He found the commercial real estate deeds. He read the current estimated valuation. It was a number so massive it made him dizzy. He saw the exact geographical coordinates of the Pierce manufacturing flagship factory. He saw the 99-year lease agreement. He traced his finger over the signature line. He looked at me, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. "You own the land," he gasped. "You own the ground his factory is built on." I leaned forward and rested my calloused hands on the kitchen table. I told him I owned the land. I owned the technology. And as of 20 minutes ago, I owned every single piece of short-term debt Carlton Pierce had to his name. Matthew just stared at me. The absolute despair that had been crushing his shoulders for the last 3 hours began to evaporate. It was rapidly replaced by a profound and overwhelming realization. He asked me why I never told him. He asked why I let him work 80-hour weeks if I was secretly a corporate titan. I looked my son dead in the eyes. I told him I kept it a secret because I wanted him to build his own legacy. I wanted him to understand the value of a hard day's work. I told him I had watched inherited wealth destroy people like Carlton. I wanted a son who was fundamentally good, not a parasite. I told Matthew he had proven his character to me. He had built a beautiful life with his own 2 hands, and because he was a good man, he was now fully equipped to help me burn a corrupt empire to the ground. The transformation in my son was incredible to witness. The beaten, humiliated man who had been crying on a park bench was completely gone. In his place sat a sharp, calculating executive who finally understood that he was holding a royal flush. He looked down at the financial blueprints. The color returned to his face. His jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. He looked back up at me. He simply asked what our next move was. I smiled. I told him it was time to lock the doors on the Pierce family from the inside. Before Matthew could even process the magnitude of the corporate documents scattered across the yellow kitchen table, the secure satellite phone began to chime from the dark hallway leading to the garage. I stood up from my chair, walked swiftly down the hall, and grabbed the heavy black device from the workbench. I pressed the answer button and brought the receiver to my ear. It was Stephen Gallagher. George Stevens said, his voice tighter and faster than it had been just an hour ago. "The debt acquisition is completely finalized. Bennett Equities now officially holds every single promissory note and line of credit attached to Pierce Manufacturing. We own his entire financial leash, but we have a severe and immediate complication." I leaned against the cold concrete wall of the garage. "Tell me," I commanded quietly. While my team was executing the rapid debt sweep, we uncovered a massive anomaly in their internal accounting structures, Stephen explained. Carlton Pierce is not just bleeding money due to poor management. He has been actively embezzling millions of dollars from the Pierce Manufacturing Employee Pension Fund for the last 3 years. He has been systematically stealing the retirement savings of his own factory workers to cover his private offshore debts and luxury real estate investments. My grip tightened around the heavy phone. And he just fired my son, who handled the supply chain logistics and had administrative access to the financial routing software. "Exactly," Stephen confirmed. "Carlton is setting Matthew up to take the absolute fall for the missing millions. But the timeline is much tighter than we anticipated. Carlton knows the federal authorities are scheduled to audit the pension fund at the end of the month. To cover his tracks, he is forcing an emergency corporate merger tomorrow morning at 9. He is selling a massive equity stake in Pierce Manufacturing to a New York venture capital firm." The pieces clicked together in my mind with sickening clarity. The venture capitalist Rachel was having dinner with tonight at the country club. She was not just marrying for a luxurious lifestyle. She was marrying to secure the immediate capital her father needed to avoid a federal prison sentence. If that merger document is signed tomorrow morning, Stephen continued, the influx of New York capital will temporarily plug the massive hole in the pension fund. Carlton will immediately activate his executive exit clause, resign as chief executive officer, and walk away with a $30 million severance package. By the time the new investors realize the company is completely hollow, Carlton will be untouchable, and the federal authorities will be kicking down your son's door with an arrest warrant for corporate fraud. We have a ticking clock, George. We have less than 24 hours to stop that signature. I did not panic. I simply calculated the new trajectory. Let him prepare his paperwork, Stephen, I said smoothly. Prepare the default notices on the commercial land lease. I will handle the venture capitalist personally tonight. I ended the call and walked back into the bright kitchen. Matthew was still staring at the patent blueprints. I placed my hands flat on the table and looked my son in the eye. I told him Rachel was not just leaving him for a richer man. I told him her father was planning to frame him for a multi-million-dollar federal embezzlement scheme by tomorrow morning. Matthew went completely rigid. The lingering sadness was entirely gone now. What replaced it was the cold, focused anger of a man who was finally ready to fight for his absolute survival. I stood in the kitchen and watched my son absorb the reality of his father-in-law's criminal intent. The profound anger burning in his dark eyes was exactly what I needed to see. I told Matthew to stay close to the financial blueprints because his specific knowledge of the corporate network was about to become our greatest weapon. I left him sitting at the yellow table and walked back down the narrow hallway to the garage. The freezing temperature in the concrete room felt perfectly suited for what I was about to do. I walked over to the steel floor vault, picked up the heavy black satellite phone again, and called Stephen back. He answered immediately, fully anticipating my orders. I told Stephen it was time to execute the default clause on the commercial land lease. I instructed him to file the heavy paperwork with the county clerk the exact second the municipal offices opened tomorrow, but to electronically serve the official legal notice to the Pierce Manufacturing Executive Board right now. I explained to Stephen that for the past 7 years, Carlton had been illegally dumping toxic chemical runoff into the soil on the east side of the factory property to save money on proper industrial waste disposal. He had paid off the local environmental inspectors to look the other way. But the commercial lease he signed with Bennett Equities all those years ago had an absolute zero-tolerance clause for any environmental contamination. By quietly dumping those harsh chemicals into the dirt, he had instantly and permanently voided his own 99-year lease. I ordered Stephen to issue a strict 24-hour eviction notice for the entire corporate manufacturing campus. Stephen asked if I wanted to alert the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. I told him to hold the government agencies back for now. We were not just shutting down a factory today. We were building an airtight cage. If the federal agents raided the building right now, it would give Carlton a public excuse to legally delay the impending merger and temporarily freeze his remaining assets. I wanted Carlton to feel the walls closing in on him personally before the government even knew what was happening. I wanted him to scramble in the dark. I then turned my attention to the black leather binder resting on the hood of my classic car. I flipped past the real estate deeds and found the master licensing agreements for the high-pressure hydraulic valves. I gave Stephen the specific corporate registry numbers for the anonymous shell companies that held the patents. I told him to draft a severe cease and desist mandate and send it directly to the factory floor managers, completely bypassing Carlton and the executive boardroom entirely. I instructed Stephen to state that Pierce Manufacturing was in massive breach of contract due to outstanding debt, and that their legal right to use, install, or manufacture my patented valve was revoked effectively immediately. I made sure to include a clause stating that if a single valve was placed on the assembly line moving forward, the floor managers themselves would be held liable for a $10 million penalty per unit. Stephen confirmed the exact orders. He noted that issuing the cease and desist directly to the working factory floor managers would cause absolute operational chaos. The frightened line workers would have to physically halt the heavy machinery to avoid personal financial liability. I told him that was exactly the point of the maneuver. I wanted the loud, beating heartbeat of Carlton's massive empire to flatline into absolute silence while he was busy trying to sell a hollow shell to the venture capitalists. I stood in the cold garage and listened as Stephen rapidly typed the commands that would destroy a billionaire. It is a very strange feeling to systematically dismantle a man's entire life with a few spoken words over a secure telephone line. But I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. Carlton Pierce had built his massive fortune on the broken backs of honest laborers, and he had treated them all like disposable dirt. He had stolen their hard-earned retirement funds to buy imported sports cars and luxury real estate. He had looked at my son, a loyal man who worked himself to the bone to make the factory profitable, and discarded him simply because of his blue-collar bloodline. He had tried to steal my only grandson. The financial strangulation I was applying to his company was not an act of petty revenge. It was a long-overdue correction of a fundamentally broken system. I told Stephen to lock the legal trap tightly and ensure no bureaucratic loopholes were left open for their corporate lawyers to exploit. He assured me the documents were airtight and completely untraceable to my residential address. The holding companies were fully insulated by layers of legal protection. Carlton would only see a faceless, massive private equity firm crushing him from all sides. He would not know it was the retired mechanic pulling the strings until it was far too late to fight back. I ended the call and let out a long, slow breath. The physical machinery of the trap was now fully operational. The land under his feet was being legally reclaimed. The core technology of his product was permanently frozen. His massive debt was entirely in my hands. But a steel cage is only useful if the animal cannot chew his way out through the back door. Carlton still had his hands on the internal corporate servers, and those servers held the digital proof of his massive pension embezzlement. If he realized the company was collapsing around him today, his first move would be to delete those specific financial routing logs, destroying the evidence and leaving Matthew holding the bag for the missing millions. I left the cold garage and walked back into the bright kitchen. Matthew was no longer just staring at the printed documents. He had pulled his personal laptop from his leather briefcase and was frantically typing on the keyboard. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with absolute determination. He knew exactly what we had to do next. The legal strangulation was my job, but securing the digital evidence required a surgeon who knew the exact anatomy of the Pierce network. I walked over to the table and looked at the glowing screen. The final phase of the trap was about to begin, and it rested entirely on the shoulders of the son they had just thrown away. I pulled a wooden chair from the corner of the kitchen and sat down next to my son. The bright yellow Formica table was now the command center for a corporate war. Matthew had his silver laptop flipped open. The bright white light from the screen illuminated his face, highlighting the deep, exhausted circles under his dark eyes. He was typing with a frantic, desperate rhythm. His fingers hammered against the flat plastic keys with the heavy force of a man fighting for his absolute life. I asked him if the factory technology department had already revoked his network security credentials when Carlton fired him. Matthew did not stop typing. He told me that his official executive login was completely disabled the second he stepped into the glass elevator this morning. He said Carlton was arrogant, but he was not stupid enough to leave the front door wide open. But Matthew was a master of supply chain logistics. He told me that managing a global assembly line required constant, uninterrupted data flow. 2 years ago, the main corporate servers crashed during a massive holiday blizzard, shutting down international shipping for 3 entire days. To prevent that from ever happening again, Matthew had secretly built a redundant administrative backdoor into the network architecture. It was a hidden digital tunnel designed to bypass the main security firewalls so he could manually reroute shipping containers in an absolute emergency. He had never told Carlton about it because Carlton did not understand the complex mathematics of the digital age. Carlton only understood brute force and intimidation. Matthew stared at a blank black screen filled with rapidly scrolling lines of green text. He was trying to pry open that hidden tunnel using my cheap suburban wireless internet connection. I watched a single bead of sweat form on his forehead and slowly roll down his temple. The tension in the small kitchen was so thick it felt difficult to pull air into my lungs. Every single passing second was a massive risk. If the factory security team detected the unauthorized intrusion before Matthew could secure the pension routing logs, they would sever the connection permanently, delete the digital evidence, and hand the remaining encrypted fragments directly to the federal authorities as absolute proof of my son's guilt. "I am in," Matthew suddenly whispered. His voice was breathless and tight. I leaned closer to the glowing screen. The black background disappeared, replaced by the familiar blue and white interface of the Pierce Manufacturing internal financial database. Matthew bypassed the standard executive dashboards and dove straight into the deep architectural layers of the server. He was moving with incredible speed, his eyes darting across thousands of file names. He explained that Carlton had a habit of hiding his personal toxic debt inside complex vendor payments. He opened a massive folder labeled Employee Retirement Allocations. My son began to cross-reference the official pension deposits with the actual wire transfers leaving the corporate accounts. The sheer magnitude of the financial betrayal was staggering to witness. Matthew opened a ledger from 3 years ago. He pointed a trembling finger at a specific string of outgoing payments. He told me to look at the date. It was late December. Matthew said that was the exact same week Carlton had called him into the boardroom and ordered him to completely slash the annual holiday bonuses for the factory floor workers, claiming the company was operating at a severe deficit. I looked at the screen. On that exact same day, Carlton had secretly wired $4 million out of the employee pension fund and routed it into an offshore holding account in the Cayman Islands to purchase a luxury yacht. He stole their futures to buy himself a boat. Matthew choked out, his voice thick with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound sorrow. "These are the men who taught me how to operate the heavy machinery when I was just a kid in the warehouse. These are the men who came to my wedding." And Carlton was actively robbing their retirement accounts while forcing me to look them in the eye and tell them the company could not afford to pay them a living wage. I placed my hand firmly on my son's shoulder. I told him to save his anger for the country club tonight. I ordered him to download every single piece of data on that screen. Matthew nodded and initiated a mass data extraction protocol. A small gray progress bar appeared in the absolute center of the screen. It estimated the total download size at nearly 40 gigabytes of encrypted financial history. It was a massive amount of data to pull through a hidden backdoor. The blue bar began to crawl slowly from left to right. 5%. 10%. The kitchen was completely silent, except for the mechanical hum of my old refrigerator and the rapid, shallow sound of my son's breathing. Suddenly, the entire computer screen flashed a harsh, violent warning in bright red text. "Unauthorized administrative access detected." Matthew cursed under his breath and began typing furiously. He told me the main security protocol had just woken up. Someone in the factory technology department had noticed the massive drain on the server bandwidth. They were actively tracing the digital tunnel back to our location. The progress bar hit 40% and suddenly stalled. The digital tug-of-war had officially begun. Matthew was fighting an entire floor of highly paid corporate security engineers from a wobbly wooden chair in my kitchen. He rapidly engaged a series of complex proxy servers bouncing our geographical location across a dozen different countries to confuse their tracking software. The red warning text multiplied across the screen. System lockdown initiated. Server severing in 60 seconds. Matthew told me they were pulling the physical plug on the internal network. He had less than 1 minute to pull the remaining files through the tunnel before the heavy steel doors slammed shut forever. The progress bar jumped to 60%, then 70%. The tension was absolute agony. I stood behind him, my heavy hands gripping the back of his wooden chair so tightly The wood began to splinter under my calloused fingers. I watched the countdown timer on the security warning tick down relentlessly. 40 seconds. 30 seconds. Come on! Matthew begged the machine, his fingers flying across the keyboard to optimize the data compression. Please do not lock me out. Not yet. 85%. 90%. The countdown timer hit 10 seconds. The computer fan began to scream, the small machine overheating from the massive processing strain. 5 seconds. 3. 2. The progress bar hit 100%. Matthew slammed his hand down on the enter key, instantly severing the connection from our side, just a fraction of a second before the red warning screen went entirely black. He pulled the small silver flash drive from the side of the laptop with a sharp, victorious movement. The computer screen reverted to his empty desktop background. The heavy digital silence rushed back into the room. Matthew fell back against the wooden chair, staring at the silver piece of metal in his shaking hand. His chest heaved with exhaustion. His shirt was completely soaked with cold sweat. He looked up at me, a wild, disbelieving smile breaking across his exhausted face. "We got it, Dad," he whispered. "Every single wire transfer, every offshore account, every fake vendor invoice. I have the entire undeniable history of his corruption sitting right here in my hand." I looked down at the tiny piece of metal that held the absolute power to destroy a billionaire. I told Matthew he had done a brilliant job. I told him he had just secured the final bullet we needed for the execution. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my heavy steel car keys. I told my son to go wash his face and put on a clean shirt. The trap was now fully armed and completely loaded. It was finally time to drive across town and introduce Carlton Pierce to the real chief executive officer of Bennett Equities. While Matthew held the small silver flash drive in my quiet kitchen, the massive gears of my trap were already grinding the Pierce manufacturing empire into absolute dust. I did not need to be standing inside his glass office building to know exactly what was happening. Matthew had left a silent monitoring program running on his laptop before he completely severed the main digital connection. Through that small window on the computer screen, we sat at my yellow table and watched the destruction of Carlton Pierce unfold in real time. It started down on the main factory floor exactly 10 minutes after Stephen sent the legal mandate. The floor managers received the direct emails regarding the patent violation on the high-pressure hydraulic valves. These were honest, working-class men who could not afford to risk a $10 million personal liability lawsuit for a boss who treated them terribly. Matthew watched the internal production monitors on his screen slowly turn from a healthy green to a flashing yellow. Then they turned to a dead flat red. One by one, the massive hydraulic presses, the assembly belts, and the heavy welding stations were manually powered down by the frightened foreman. For the first time in 30 years, the deafening mechanical roar of the Pierce flagship factory was replaced by a terrifying heavy silence. The workers just stood around their idle machines, completely confused, as the lifeblood of the company simply stopped flowing. 10 floors up in the executive glass suites, the true panic was just beginning to take root. Stephen had executed the debt acquisition perfectly. When a shadow equity firm suddenly buys out $40 million of commercial debt, it triggers an automatic financial earthquake across the entire manufacturing industry. The automated system flags went off at every single supplier connected to the Pierce network. The steel providers, the rubber manufacturers, and the shipping logistics companies all received instant notifications that Pierce Manufacturing was now considered a catastrophic credit risk. We watched the internal security camera feeds on Matthew's laptop as 3 massive delivery trucks literally stopped at the factory security gates and reversed right back out onto the main highway. The suppliers were refusing to drop off a single piece of raw material because they knew Carlton no longer had the financial backing to pay for it. Then the fatal legal blow landed on their desks. The eviction notice for the environmental contamination was successfully served to the executive board. It was a strict 24-hour mandate to completely vacate a commercial property they had comfortably occupied for 3 generations. We listened to the intercepted audio feed from the main administrative office. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. Senior vice presidents were screaming at their legal assistants. The corporate lawyers were frantically trying to call the county judges, but the judges could not magically override a private commercial lease violation. They were completely trapped in a legal cage of their own making. And right in the center of that magnificent disaster was Carlton Pierce. He had spent his entire morning gloating in a boardroom about destroying my son and insulting my bloodline. Now he was watching his grandfather's legacy evaporate into thin air in less than 2 hours. According to the internal communications, Carlton was pacing wildly around his mahogany conference table, screaming into his cellular phone. He was desperately trying to call his private bankers, but his bankers had already sold his debt directly to me. He tried to call the material suppliers, but they completely refused to answer his calls. He was an arrogant king who suddenly realized his entire kingdom was built on a massive sinkhole, and the ground was rapidly giving way beneath his expensive leather shoes. He still did not know that the retired mechanic he mocked that morning was the hidden architect of his total demise. He thought Bennett Equities was just a ruthless New York investment firm looking to strip his remaining assets. He was incredibly desperate to save the upcoming merger with the venture capitalist tonight, because that was his only remaining escape route to avoid a federal prison sentence. The digital monitors in my kitchen showed that Carlton had ordered his executive team to keep the factory shutdown an absolute secret from the press and the incoming investors. He was going to try and sell a dead hollow company tonight at his elite country club. I closed Matthew's laptop and told my son to put his heavy winter coat back on. Carlton was bleeding out, but he was still trying to crawl toward the finish line. It was time for us to meet him there and permanently close the door in his face. While Matthew walked down the narrow hallway to wash the cold sweat from his face and put on a clean shirt, the secure satellite phone resting on the yellow kitchen table began to vibrate. I picked it up and answered. Stephen was on the other end of the line, and I could hear a rare trace of actual amusement in his usually cold corporate voice. He told me that the legal team representing Carlton Pierce had been desperately calling the Bennett Equities dummy routing numbers for the past 45 minutes. Stephen said Carlton was in a state of absolute blind panic. His manufacturing factory was completely shut down. His suppliers had permanently abandoned him, and his expensive lawyers could not find a single judge willing to block our commercial eviction notice. Carlton was completely cornered, and he knew his empire was bleeding to death. But a narcissist never truly believes he is permanently defeated. Stephen told me that Carlton was begging for an immediate face-to-face meeting with the anonymous chief executive officer of Bennett Equities. He was hosting a private dinner tonight at the Oak Ridge Country Club with the New York venture capitalist. Carlton wanted the mysterious head of our firm to join them in the exclusive dining room. He honestly believed he could sit across from a ruthless Wall Street billionaire, buy him an expensive steak, pour him a glass of vintage wine, and charm his way out of a total financial execution. He thought he could use the presence of the new venture capitalist to prove his company still had massive future value and negotiate a settlement. He had absolutely no idea he was rolling out the red carpet for the exact same retired mechanic he had publicly humiliated and discarded just 9 hours ago. I looked at the small silver flash drive resting on my kitchen counter, holding the undeniable proof of his federal crimes. Tell his desperate lawyers that the chief executive officer graciously accepts his invitation, I instructed Stephen. Tell them I will arrive at the Oak Ridge Country Club at exactly 8:00 tonight. Tell them to make sure Carlton is sitting right there at the table waiting for me. Stephen confirmed the strict instructions and ended the call. Matthew walked back into the kitchen wearing a clean, dark suit. He looked sharp, focused, and completely ready for a war. I grabbed my worn canvas jacket from the hook by the door. I did not put on a tuxedo or a tailored business suit. I wore my heavy denim jeans, my scuffed steel-toed work boots, and the same faded flannel shirt I had worn all day long. I wanted Carlton to see exactly what a dirty mechanic bloodline looked like right before it completely destroyed his pristine legacy. We walked out the front door and climbed into the cold cab of my rusted 2004 Ford truck. The heavy engine roared to life, shattering the quiet suburban evening. I put the old truck in gear, and we began the long drive across town toward the elite gated community. We drove past the massive mansions and manicured lawns of the wealthy district. We were heading straight into the luxurious heart of Carlton's kingdom, but this time we were not going as his silent victims. We were arriving as his absolute executioners. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The valet attendant in a crisp white uniform stared at my rusted Ford truck in absolute horror as I parked it directly between a gleaming black Bentley and a silver luxury sedan. I handed the terrified boy my heavy steel keys and walked up the wide marble steps with Matthew right beside me. The interior of the club was a monument to unearned wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the rich mahogany walls and thick velvet carpets. We did not stop at the reception desk. I knew exactly where the private dining rooms were located. As we approached the heavy oak doors of the VIP suite, I held up my hand, signaling Matthew to stop. The doors were slightly ajar to let the soft classical music from the main hall filter into the private room. Through the narrow gap, we had a perfect, unobstructed view of the table, and we could hear every single arrogant word they were speaking. Carlton Pierce was sitting at the head of a massive round table covered in pristine white linen and expensive heavy silverware. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my entire suburban house. Sitting to his right was Rachel, looking absolutely radiant, in a dark silk evening gown dripping with diamond jewelry she had undoubtedly bought with my son's hard-earned money. Sitting across from them was Vincent Blake, the ruthless venture capitalist from New York. Vincent looked exactly like the kind of man who destroyed working-class companies for sport. He was swirling a glass of deep red wine and listening intently to Carlton speak. Carlton was putting on the absolute performance of his life. He leaned forward and told Vincent that the sudden operational halt at the main factory today was simply a planned, strategic retooling. He lied with such incredible ease it was almost frightening to witness. He claimed he had intentionally paused the assembly lines to prepare for the massive influx of capital the merger would bring tomorrow morning. He completely fabricated a story about upgrading the heavy machinery. When Vincent brought up the sudden commercial eviction notice regarding the toxic environmental contamination, Carlton just laughed, his booming voice echoing off the painted walls of the private room. He waved his hand dismissively and called the eviction a pathetic clerical error filed by an incompetent municipal clerk. He assured the wealthy investor that Pierce Manufacturing was fundamentally bulletproof and that the minor debt acquisitions taking place in the market were just aggressive maneuvers by smaller firms trying to ride his powerful coattails. He spoke about his legacy as if he were a king discussing his absolute divine right to rule the world. Vincent took a slow sip of his expensive wine and asked Carlton about the mysterious chief executive officer of Bennett Equities who was joining them tonight. Vincent noted that buying up $40 million of commercial debt in a single morning was an incredibly aggressive and hostile move. Carlton just smiled, leaning back in his velvet chair. He confidently declared that the anonymous executive was just another greedy Wall Street parasite looking for a quick and easy payout. He told Vincent they would simply offer the man a small premium on the debt, fold him into the new corporate structure, and force him to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement before the dessert course was even served. Carlton actually boasted that men with sudden money were the easiest people in the world to manipulate because their endless greed always blinded their basic common sense. Rachel chimed in, her voice dripping with false sophistication. She smiled warmly at Vincent and told him her father was an absolute master at handling hostile negotiations. She practically purred as she assured the wealthy investor that the Pierce family always eliminated their obstacles with extreme prejudice and flawless precision. Vincent smiled back, clearly charmed by her ruthless demeanor. He asked Rachel about her husband, noting that he had heard rumors from the corporate board about a sudden divorce filing that morning. Rachel did not even flinch at the mention of the man she had married. She took a delicate sip of her champagne and completely dismissed the 7 years she had spent building a life with my son. She told Vincent that Matthew was a tragic mistake from her youth. She called him a weak, uneducated mechanic who simply lacked the intellectual capacity to survive in their highly competitive elite world. She actually laughed out loud and said she had finally cut the dead weight from her life so she could focus entirely on securing the financial future of the Pierce empire alongside a man of true status. Matthew stood completely still next to me in the quiet, carpeted hallway, listening to the woman he had loved completely erase his humanity for a chance at a corporate bailout. He did not look sad or broken anymore. He looked like a man who was finally wide awake to the absolute truth. I looked at my son and gave him a single firm nod of approval. The grand illusion was over. It was time to pull the heavy velvet curtain down on their pathetic theatrical performance. I reached out, pushed the heavy oak doors wide open, and stepped out of the shadows into the bright light of the VIP dining room. The music from the main hall swelled for a brief second before the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind us. We stepped onto the thick Persian rug of the private dining room. The sudden intrusion caused an immediate and absolute silence to fall over the table. Carlton Pierce was in the middle of taking a drink from his crystal water glass. He froze completely. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he looked at my faded flannel shirt, my worn denim jeans, and my scuffed steel-toed work boots dirtying his pristine sanctuary. Vincent Blake, the New York venture capitalist, stopped swirling his expensive red wine and stared at us with a look of profound confusion. Rachel practically dropped her silver salad fork onto her porcelain plate. She looked at Matthew like he was a disgusting insect that had just crawled out of the floorboards. For a few heavy seconds, nobody said a single word. Then the shock on Carlton's face slowly melted away. It was replaced by a massive, arrogant, and incredibly ugly smile. He set his crystal glass down on the white linen tablecloth and let out a booming theatrical laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. He actually clapped his hands together as if he were watching a highly entertaining comedy routine. He leaned back in his velvet dining chair and looked at me with absolute dripping condescension. He announced to the entire table that the retired mechanic had finally come to his absolute senses. He told Vincent Blake not to be alarmed by the unwashed intrusion. He pointed a manicured finger at me and told the wealthy investor that I was simply a desperate local handyman who had come to collect a generous charity donation. Carlton stood up from his chair, smoothing the lapels of his custom tuxedo. He walked slowly around the edge of the large circular table, treating us like pathetic exhibits in a museum. He looked at Matthew and clicked his tongue in mock sympathy. He said it was incredibly tragic to see his former supply chain manager reduced to begging for scraps on the same day he was fired. He told Matthew that he should have stayed home and packed his bags instead of embarrassing himself in front of high society. He claimed that showing up at an exclusive country club uninvited was exactly the kind of low-class behavior that proved our bloodline was completely incompatible with the Pierce family legacy. He went on to say that men like us were born to serve men like him, and that it was fundamentally unnatural for us to try and climb out of our designated place in the world. Rachel quickly chimed in, eager to impress the venture capitalist sitting across from her. She sneered at Matthew and told him he was absolutely pathetic for dragging his old father across town just to grovel for a settlement check. She turned her body toward Vincent and apologized profusely for the interruption. She claimed we were just a tragic reminder of her past mistakes and assured him that her father was handling the disposal of our family with extreme generosity. She promised the investor that once this minor unpleasantness was concluded, they could focus entirely on the massive profits of tomorrow morning's merger. Vincent Blake simply sat there observing the entire interaction with cold, calculating eyes. He was a man who made billions of dollars by reading the subtle power dynamics of a room. He looked at Carlton's sweating forehead. He looked at Rachel's desperate overcompensation, and then he looked at me. I was standing completely still, my hands resting calmly at my sides, making absolutely no effort to defend myself against their vicious insults. Vincent did not say a word, but his posture shifted slightly. He recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with Carlton's narrative. Prey does not walk directly into the predator's den and stand perfectly still. Carlton walked over to a small wooden serving cart and picked up a black leather checkbook. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his tuxedo pocket. He did not even look at us as he began to write. He loudly declared that my presence here tonight was highly inappropriate, but he was willing to overlook my extreme lack of manners because he was a forgiving man. He said he assumed I had finally thought about his incredibly generous offer from this morning. He boasted to Vincent that he was currently writing a personal check for $50,000 to help an impoverished grandfather pay off his miserable suburban mortgage. He held the small piece of paper up in the air, waving it back and forth like a piece of raw meat in front of a starving animal. He told me to take the money, take my disgraced son, and leave the city before he changed his mind and let us rot in absolute poverty. He added that if I ever tried to contact my grandson again, he would use his legal team to ensure I spent my final years locked inside a state-funded nursing home. Matthew stood right next to me, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle ticking in his cheek. He had to use every single ounce of his willpower to stop himself from lunging across the room and grabbing his former father-in-law by the throat. But Matthew remembered the plan. He knew that physical violence was the absolute lowest form of power. He kept his feet planted firmly on the floor and stared directly through Carlton. I did not reach for the check. I did not blink. I simply stared at Carlton Pierce with the cold, dead eyes of a man inspecting a rotting corpse. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the heavy tension to suffocate his arrogant performance. My absolute silence deeply unnerved Carlton. His arrogant smile began to falter slightly at the edges. He lowered the check. He demanded to know why I was not speaking. He asked if I was too stupid to understand the magnitude of the money he was offering me. He took a step closer, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. He yelled that I was wasting his highly valuable time and humiliating him in front of his important guest. He pointed his gold pen directly at my chest and ordered me to take the check and get out of his sight immediately. When I still did not move a single muscle, Carlton's fragile ego completely fractured. The facade of the sophisticated billionaire vanished entirely, leaving behind a terrified, desperate man who felt his control slipping away. He turned around and aggressively slammed his fist down on a small brass service bell resting on the dining table. The sharp ringing sound pierced the heavy tension in the room. Within seconds, the side door of the VIP suite swung open, and the country club manager rushed into the room, followed closely by two large security guards dressed in dark suits. The manager looked completely horrified to see two men in working-class clothes standing in his most exclusive dining area. Carlton pointed a shaking finger at us. His voice was shrill and completely stripped of its former artificial sophistication. He ordered the manager to physically remove us from the premises. He screamed that we were trespassing on private property and harassing his family. He demanded that the security guards throw us out into the street and call the local police to have us permanently arrested for extortion. The two large guards immediately stepped forward, cracking their knuckles and preparing to physically grab my shoulders. They expected me to shrink back in fear or turn around and run. Instead, I simply stood my ground and let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. Carlton crossed his arms over his chest, panting heavily, as he waited for the absolute satisfaction of watching me get dragged away like a common criminal. He thought he had just won the final battle. He had absolutely no idea the true executioner was already standing in the hallway directly behind us. One of the large security guards reached out his heavy hand to grab my left shoulder. Before his thick fingers could even brush the worn fabric of my flannel shirt, a sharp voice cut through the heavy tension of the room like the crack of a whip. "Stop right there," the voice commanded. The heavy oak doors swung open wider, and Stephen Gallagher walked into the private VIP dining room. He did not look like a cheap local family attorney. Stephen was wearing a pristine charcoal gray suit that radiated absolute authority, and he carried a thick black leather briefcase in his right hand. He walked past the confused country club manager without even sparing him a single glance. He stopped directly behind the two large security guards and told them in a voice entirely devoid of fear that if they laid a single finger on his client, they would both be personally named in a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit before they woke up tomorrow morning. The guards immediately stepped back, lowering their hands and looking at the club manager, who frantically waved for them to stand down and step away from the table. Carlton stood at the head of the dining table, completely bewildered by the sudden appearance of this sharp corporate litigator. He demanded to know who Stephen was and who had authorized him to enter a highly private event. Stephen walked smoothly past the terrified guards and stood directly next to me. He placed his heavy black briefcase flat on the white linen tablecloth, right next to the $50,000 check Carlton had just written. He looked at Carlton with the cold, clinical expression of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal disease. "My name is Stephen Gallagher," he announced, his voice projecting clearly across the quiet velvet room. "I am the senior legal counsel and primary representative for Bennett Equities." The color instantly drained from Carlton's bloated face. The sheer blinding arrogance that had animated his body just moments ago completely vanished, leaving behind a pale mask of sudden uncertainty. Rachel let out a small, sharp gasp and covered her mouth with her heavily jeweled hand. Vincent Blake, the wealthy venture capitalist from New York, immediately sat up straight in his velvet chair, his sharp eyes darting between Stephen and Carlton. Vincent was a predator, and he instantly recognized the smell of blood in the water. Carlton swallowed hard, trying desperately to regain his footing on a floor that was rapidly falling away beneath him. He forced a weak, nervous smile and tried to smooth the lapels of his custom tuxedo jacket again. "Mr. Gallagher," he stammered, his voice completely losing its former booming resonance. "We were just discussing your firm. I am thrilled you decided to join us in person. I am absolutely sure we can negotiate a highly profitable arrangement regarding the minor commercial debt your firm acquired this morning." Stephen did not return the fake smile. He popped the two brass latches on his leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the silent room. "We are not here to negotiate anything," Carlton Stevens said flatly. "We are here to officially serve you with the final termination papers regarding your entire corporate empire." Stephen pulled out a massive stack of thick legal documents and dropped them heavily onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Those are the formal notices of absolute default," Stephen continued without pausing for breath. "As of this exact hour, Bennett Equities owns $40 million of your high-interest commercial debt, which you absolutely cannot pay. We have also legally frozen your unauthorized use of our patented high-pressure hydraulic valves, which is exactly why your main factory floor went completely dark and silent this afternoon. And we have officially filed the immediate eviction mandate to seize the land your flagship factory is sitting on due to your illegal dumping of toxic chemicals into the local soil." Vincent Blake stood up from his chair, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. He looked at Carlton and demanded to know if this was the absolute truth. He yelled that Carlton had just looked him in the eye and promised him the factory was pausing for a simple mechanical upgrade. Carlton held his trembling hands up in a frantic pleading gesture, begging the wealthy investor to calm down, and promising that this was all just a massive misunderstanding created by aggressive competitors. Carlton turned back to Stephen, his eyes wide with absolute blind panic. He pleaded with Stephen, claiming he could offer Bennett Equities a massive equity stake in the manufacturing company if they just gave him 24 hours to finalize the corporate merger with Vincent. Stephen simply shook his head, his expression utterly devoid of pity. "You do not have a company to offer us, Carlton," Stephen replied coldly. And Bennett Equities does not negotiate with desperate thieves who systematically steal from their own employee pension funds. Vincent Blake physically recoiled from the table, as if the linen cloth had suddenly caught on fire. He realized in a fraction of a second that he was not being invited to invest in a legacy company. He was being used as a blind scapegoat to bail out a federal criminal. Vincent threw his expensive linen napkin onto his half-eaten dinner, grabbed his suit jacket from the back of his chair, and began walking rapidly toward the exit. Carlton screamed for him to wait, but the investor did not even look back. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind Vincent, severing Carlton's last possible lifeline to the outside world. Carlton looked like he had been physically struck in the chest with a heavy hammer. His breathing became incredibly shallow and ragged. He looked frantically around the room, trying to find a way out of the invisible steel cage that had just dropped permanently over his life. He demanded to speak to the chief executive officer of Bennett Equities immediately. He screamed that he would not let a faceless New York investment firm steal his grandfather's legacy through underhanded legal tricks. He demanded to look the man in the eye who was trying to ruin his life. Stephen reached into his black briefcase one final time. He pulled out the master incorporation document for Bennett Equities. It was the exact same piece of heavy parchment paper I had shown Matthew on my kitchen table earlier that day. Stephen slid the document across the smooth white tablecloth until it came to a complete stop directly in front of Carlton's shaking hands. He told Carlton that the chief executive officer was standing right in front of him. Carlton looked down at the document. His bloodshot eyes frantically scanned the dense legal text until they reached the bottom of the page. He saw the printed title of Chief Executive Officer, and right above that formal title, he saw my legally witnessed signature written in bold black ink. George Bennett. Carlton stared at the ink for a long, agonizing moment. The absolute impossible reality of the situation finally crashed down onto his shoulders with the crushing weight of a collapsing concrete building. He slowly looked up from the paper and stared directly into my eyes. The man who had mocked my worn clothes, the man who had called me a dirty peasant, the man who had ordered my only son to be escorted out of his corporate building like a common criminal, was finally looking at the real source of his entire wealth. The physical collapse of his massive ego was a spectacular thing to witness. His knees completely buckled beneath his expensive, tailored trousers. He grabbed the edge of the dining table to stop himself from falling over, rattling the crystal glassware and spilling his expensive ice water across the white linen. He let out a pathetic, whimpering sound that was so small and weak it was almost difficult to hear. He looked at my steel-toed boots and my faded flannel shirt. He finally understood that the man he had spent years trying to humiliate was actually the silent architect of his entire fortune. He realized that every single time he insulted my working-class bloodline, he was insulting the exact hand that graciously fed his family. He tried to speak, to apologize, to beg for mercy, but his throat was completely paralyzed by absolute terror. He just stood there, trembling violently, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He had absolutely nothing left. No power, no leverage, no money, and no escape. While Carlton Pierce was practically hyperventilating against the edge of the dining table, my eyes shifted toward my daughter-in-law. Rachel had been completely silent during the entire devastating revelation. She stood frozen next to her velvet chair, her expensive diamond earrings glittering under the bright crystal chandelier. I watched the complex gears rapidly turning inside her cold, calculating mind. She looked down at her father, who was now nothing more than a broken, sobbing shell of a man facing federal prison. Then she looked across the room at the heavy oak doors, where the wealthy venture capitalist had just completely abandoned them. Finally, her eyes landed directly on my son. The sheer speed of her emotional transformation was absolutely terrifying to witness. It was the primal survival instinct of a pure parasite realizing its current host was completely dead and frantically trying to attach itself to a new one. Less than 10 minutes ago, she had sat in that exact same chair and laughed with a billionaire about how Matthew was a pathetic, uneducated mechanic who dragged her down. Now she was looking at the sole heir to a massive private equity empire. She realized that the dirty bloodline she had spent the entire day insulting was actually the only thing that could save her from total financial ruin. Rachel took a slow, hesitant step toward us. The cruel, arrogant sneer that had been permanently plastered across her face all morning completely vanished. In its place, she manufactured a mask of profound sorrow and desperate relief. She let out a soft, trembling breath and actually forced genuine tears to well up in her eyes. It was a theatrical performance that belonged on a professional stage. She walked right past her weeping father without even offering him a single comforting hand. In fact, she deliberately stepped over his expensive leather shoe to get closer to my son. Carlton looked up at his daughter in absolute disbelief. His breathing hitched as he watched Rachel completely abandon him. He reached out a shaking hand toward her dark silk dress, but she sharply pulled away, refusing to even acknowledge his existence. She had learned her ruthless self-preservation directly from him, and now she was using his exact same tactics to survive his spectacular downfall. She crossed the thick Persian carpet and stopped just a few feet away from Matthew. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice cracking with perfectly calibrated vulnerability. "Oh my God, Matthew, I am so incredibly sorry." Matthew did not move. He stood with his feet planted firmly on the floor, his dark eyes locked onto her face. He did not say a single word. He just waited to see how deep her incredible lies would actually go. Rachel took another step closer, reaching out with her manicured hands, as if she wanted to grab the lapels of his clean suit jacket. She looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "You have to understand," she pleaded, her voice dripping with fake desperation. "You have to know that I never actually wanted any of this. My father forced me to do it, Matthew. He told me that if I did not pack your bags and file those horrible divorce papers, he was going to completely cut off my trust fund and kick us out onto the street. He forced me to call those horrible process servers this morning. He made me threaten your father. I was completely terrified. I was just trying to protect our beautiful boy from his absolute wrath. I thought if I played along with his sick game for just a few days, I could secretly convince him to give you your job back." She paused, trying to gauge my son's reaction. When Matthew remained completely stone-faced, she increased the intensity of her performance. She let a single tear roll down her perfectly powdered cheek. "When I saw you walk through those doors tonight, my heart just broke," she lied, her voice taking on a sickly sweet tone of absolute devotion. "I was sitting here with that awful investor thinking about how much I loved you. I hated every single word I had to say about you. I was just playing along to keep my father calm until I could figure out a way for us to escape him. But now we do not have to escape Matthew. Your father has saved us. We can finally be a real family again. Just you, me, and Leo. We can take over the company together. We can leave all of this toxic mess behind us and start completely over." She finally closed the distance between them and placed her hands flat against Matthew's chest. She looked up at him with a smile that was meant to be loving, but looked completely hollow. "Please bring me home to our son," she whispered. "I have loved you since the day we met, and I will never let anyone tear us apart ever again." I stood quietly next to Stephen Gallagher, watching this horrific display of emotional manipulation. It was genuinely sickening to hear her weaponize my grandson to save her own luxurious lifestyle. She did not care about Leo when she sent armed men to my house this morning. She did not care about Matthew when she was laughing with Vincent Blake 5 minutes ago. She only cared about the massive holding company my name was printed on, and the unimaginable wealth Matthew was now destined to inherit. I did not step in to protect Matthew. I did not say a single word to expose her obvious lies. This was the ultimate test of my son's character. I had given him the absolute truth, and I had handed him the power to destroy the people who had abused him. But I could not make this specific choice for him. He had to look at the woman who had handed him his luggage in a glass lobby and decide if he was going to fall back into her toxic trap or finally cut the poison out of his life forever. The entire room was completely silent, waiting for his answer. The heavy silence in the private dining room stretched out for what felt like an absolute eternity. Rachel kept her manicured hands pressed flat against my son's chest, looking up at him with those wide, perfectly manufactured tears pooling in her eyes. She was waiting for the familiar warmth to return to his face. She was waiting for the loyal, accommodating man she had controlled for 7 years to wrap his arms around her and tell her everything was going to be all right. I watched the subtle rise and fall of Matthew's breathing. Just a few hours ago, sitting on that cold park bench, he would have given absolutely anything to hear her say those words. He would have forgiven her instantly and taken her back without a single question just to keep his family intact. But the man who was standing in front of her now was not the same man she had discarded in the corporate lobby this morning. The fires of absolute betrayal had burned away all of his naive illusions, leaving behind a core of solid, unbreakable steel. Matthew slowly raised his hands. He did not embrace her. He grabbed her wrists with a firm, unyielding grip and physically peeled her hands off of his clean suit jacket. He pushed her arms away and took a deliberate step backward, severing the physical connection between them. Rachel let out a small, confused gasp. Her fake tears spilled over her eyelashes, but Matthew did not reach out to wipe them away. He looked at her with a level of forensic detachment that was absolutely chilling. He looked at her the exact same way I had looked at her father. "Rachel," he began, his voice completely steady and devoid of any emotional warmth. "You have always been an incredibly talented liar, but you are performing for the wrong audience tonight. Do not stand there and insult my intelligence by claiming your father forced you to abandon me. I saw the look on your face when you handed me those 4 designer suitcases. I saw the absolute disgust in your eyes. You were not a terrified victim trying to protect our son. You were a willing participant. You were a woman who had just calculated my net worth and decided I was no longer a profitable investment." Rachel shook her head violently, her diamond earrings swinging wildly. "No, Matthew," she pleaded, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. "You are completely misunderstanding the situation. I was under extreme duress. I had to make it look convincing so my father would not suspect anything." Matthew let out a short, bitter laugh that held absolutely zero humor. It echoed sharply against the mahogany walls. "You made it look incredibly convincing, Rachel," he said, his tone dropping to a sharp, dangerous whisper. "You filed an emergency ex parte custody order filled with absolute perjury. You sent 2 armed process servers to my father's house to physically rip a 6-year-old boy away from his family. You did not do that to protect Leo. You did that to completely destroy me so you could legally clear the path to marry a venture capitalist by the end of the month. You wanted to secure your luxurious lifestyle, and you were perfectly willing to use our child as a pawn to buy your way into another billionaire's bank account." She opened her mouth to protest, but Matthew completely cut her off, raising his hand to silence her. He told her to save her breath. He pointed out the magnificent hypocrisy of her sudden change of heart. He noted that she had spent the entire morning and the entire afternoon believing he was a poor, unemployed mechanic, and during all those hours she did not send a single text message or make a single phone call to check on the man she supposedly loved. He said her deep, unconditional love only miraculously reappeared the exact second Stephen Gallagher opened his leather briefcase and revealed that her peasant husband was actually the sole heir to a $40 million corporate empire. He told her she did not love him at all. She only loved the massive financial parachute he suddenly represented. Rachel began to tremble genuinely this time. The polished mask of the victim completely shattered, leaving behind the raw, desperate panic of a woman who realized her absolute last lifeline had just been cut. "Matthew," she begged, reaching out for him again. "Please do not do this. We have a history together. We built a beautiful house. We share a child. You cannot just throw me away like this." Matthew stared at her, his face completely unforgiving. You threw me away first, Rachel, he reminded her coldly. You just did not realize you were throwing away a winning lottery ticket. Matthew reached his hand inside the breast pocket of his dark suit jacket. He did not pull out a handkerchief to dry her tears. He pulled out a thick, folded envelope made of heavy white legal paper. He held it tightly in his right hand. Earlier this afternoon, while my father was systematically dismantling your father's corporate empire, I asked Stephen Gallagher to draft a few documents of my own. Matthew explained, his voice ringing with absolute finality. I am not going to fight you in a messy public family court for the next 5 years. I am not going to let you drain my accounts with expensive divorce lawyers. I am ending this right now on my exact terms. He held the thick white envelope out toward her. Rachel stared at it like it was a venomous snake preparing to strike. Take it, Matthew commanded, his voice echoing with the exact same undeniable authority his father had used to build an empire. Rachel slowly reached out with shaking fingers and took the envelope. Matthew did not wait for her to open it. He dictated the terms directly to her face. Those are the formal papers for an absolute, uncontested divorce, he stated. I am claiming full physical and legal custody of Leo immediately. You will have supervised visitation rights every other weekend, strictly determined by a court-appointed mediator. Because you filed an emergency custody motion this morning, based entirely on verifiable perjury and financial abuse, the judge will grant my petition without a single hesitation. Furthermore, you are signing away any right to claim spousal support alimony or any share of the Bennett Equities portfolio. Rachel gasped, clutching the envelope to her chest. You cannot do that, she cried, her voice shrill and broken. You cannot leave me with absolutely nothing. I will fight you in court. I will hire the best lawyers in the state. Matthew leaned in slightly, his dark eyes piercing right through her terrified facade. With what money, Rachel? He asked quietly. Your father's bank accounts are permanently frozen. Your trust fund is completely empty. The Pierce manufacturing legacy is dead. You do not have a single dime to your name. If you sign those papers right now, I will agree to pay off the remaining lease on your luxury car so you do not have to walk home tonight. If you refuse to sign them, my father and I will hand over the digital server logs, proving your father's massive pension embezzlement to the federal authorities before midnight, and you will spend the next 10 years visiting your father in a maximum security federal prison. Rachel looked over at Carlton, who was still leaning heavily against the dining table, weeping silently into his hands. She realized with absolute crushing certainty that she was completely trapped. There was no escape. There was no negotiation. Matthew had completely outmaneuvered her using the exact same ruthless precision her own family had taught him. The loyal, accommodating husband was dead, and the new chief executive officer of Bennett Equities had just executed his very first flawless victory. Matthew turned his back on her, completely dismissing her existence, and walked over to stand proudly by my side. Matthew stood tall and proud by my side, having successfully completely excised the parasite from his life. I gave him a brief nod of profound respect. Then I turned my attention toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the private dining room. Vincent Blake, the wealthy venture capitalist from New York, was standing there with his hand firmly gripping the brass door handle. He was desperately trying to escape the messy legal disaster unfolding around him. Stop right there, Mr. Blake! I called out, my voice easily cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Vincent froze and slowly turned around to face me, his expression guarded and defensive. He told me he wanted absolutely nothing to do with this local corporate warfare and that he was washing his hands of the entire Pierce family. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. I told him I completely understood his desire to leave, but as a man who managed billions of dollars in private equity, he needed to see exactly how close he had just come to stepping directly onto a massive financial landmine. I reached my calloused hand into the front pocket of my faded flannel shirt. I pulled out the small silver flash drive that my son had miraculously pulled through the hidden digital tunnel just hours earlier. I walked over to the dining table and dropped the piece of metal onto the pristine white linen right next to the pathetic $50,000 check Carlton had written for me. The small drive made a sharp clinking sound against the heavy silverware. Vincent let go of the brass door handle and took a few hesitant steps back toward the table, his sharp, predatory eyes locked on the silver drive. He asked me what it was. I looked directly at Carlton Pierce, who was now sweating profusely, his chest heaving with absolute terror. I told Vincent that the massive commercial debt and the voided land leases were only the beginning of Carlton's massive problems. I pointed to the flash drive and announced that it contained 40 gigabytes of highly encrypted internal server logs directly from the Pierce Manufacturing Financial Network. I told the investor that Carlton had not just mismanaged his grandfather's legacy, he had been actively and systematically embezzling millions of dollars from his own employee pension funds for the last 3 years to pay for luxury yachts and private offshore real estate. Vincent Blake stopped breathing. The color drained from his sophisticated face. He looked at Carlton in absolute horror. Carlton violently shook his head back and forth, desperately trying to deny the accusation, but he was so paralyzed by fear that his vocal cords completely failed him. He could only let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. I did not let Carlton recover. I looked back at Vincent and laid out the exact mechanics of the trap Carlton had built for him. I told Vincent that the federal authorities were scheduled to thoroughly audit the factory pension funds at the end of the month. Carlton was completely trapped and out of time. He was forcing this emergency corporate merger tomorrow morning because he desperately needed your massive influx of New York capital to temporarily plug the giant hole he had ripped in the retirement accounts. I explained, my voice ringing with undeniable truth. He was going to use your money to hide his federal crimes long enough to activate his executive exit clause. He was going to take a $30 million golden parachute and disappear completely, leaving you holding a hollow bankrupt shell of a company. He was going to let you and my son take the absolute fall for the missing millions while he drank expensive wine on a beach. Vincent walked slowly up to the table, his expensive leather shoes making no sound against the thick carpet. He stared at the silver flash drive, and then he slowly raised his head to look Carlton directly in the eyes. The venture capitalist was no longer just a wealthy man looking to protect his portfolio. He was a deeply powerful man who realized he had almost been used as a blind accessory to a massive federal crime. Vincent leaned over the white linen table, placing his palms flat on the surface. His voice dropped to a terrifyingly quiet whisper that was far more intimidating than any loud scream. "You arrogant, pathetic thief," Vincent sneered, his face just inches away from Carlton's sweating forehead. "You honestly thought you could use my capital to clean up your disgusting criminal mess. You thought you could outsmart me." Vincent stood up straight and buttoned his custom suit jacket. He declared with absolute cold finality that the merger was completely dead. He promised Carlton that before his private jet even landed back in New York, he would personally make sure every single major financial institution on the eastern seaboard knew exactly what kind of toxic poison the Pierce family truly was. He swore that Carlton would never see another dime of corporate funding for the rest of his miserable life. Vincent turned away from the shattered billionaire. He looked at me and gave me a short, deeply respectful nod, acknowledging that my working-class hands had just saved him from a massive catastrophic disaster. Then he turned around, walked straight out the heavy oak doors and let them slam firmly shut behind him. The loud echo of the closing door was the final nail in the coffin. Carlton Pierce collapsed heavily into his velvet dining chair, completely stripped of his company, his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. He was left with absolutely nothing. The heavy oak doors remained completely still after Vincent Blake made his final exit. The soft classical music from the main country club hall was no longer filtering into the private VIP suite, leaving us in a heavy, suffocating quiet. Carlton Pierce was slouched so deeply in his expensive velvet dining chair, he looked like a deflated, empty shell of a human being. His custom-tailored tuxedo was heavily wrinkled, and his breathing had devolved into a series of shallow, ragged gasps. I slowly walked around the edge of the large circular table until I was standing directly over him. I did not raise my voice or attempt to physically intimidate him. True absolute power does not ever need to shout. I looked down at the pathetic man who had spent his entire morning trying to systematically destroy my only son. I told Carlton to sit up straight and look me directly in the eyes. He slowly raised his heavy head. His face was completely covered in a thick layer of cold, clammy sweat, and his eyes were entirely hollow. He looked exactly like a cornered, wounded animal that finally realized the steel trap was locked permanently around its leg. I told him the arrogant, theatrical performance he had been putting on for decades was officially over, and it was time to discuss the cold, absolute reality of his immediate future. I placed my calloused hands flat on the pristine white linen tablecloth, right next to his empty crystal water glass. I laid out the brutal, undeniable truth of his current situation. I told Carlton he had exactly 12 hours to save himself from spending the rest of his natural life inside a federal penitentiary. I dictated the first absolute condition of his surrender. By 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, he was going to draft a formal, legally binding letter of immediate resignation. He was going to step down as the chief executive officer of Pierce Manufacturing, completely relinquishing all operational and administrative control over the company his grandfather had built. Furthermore, he was not going to activate his lucrative executive severance package. I told him that every single share of corporate equity he currently held in his name was going to be legally transferred directly into the employee pension fund. He was going to completely restore the millions of dollars he had systematically stolen from the hardworking men and women on the factory floor. He was going to give them back their retirement savings using his own massive inheritance. Carlton let out a desperate, choking sound. He shook his head wildly from side to side, his silver hair falling completely out of place. He pleaded with me, his voice cracking violently. He claimed that if he surrendered all of his corporate equity, he would be left with absolutely nothing to his name. He cried that he would instantly lose his massive gated mansion, his luxury imported cars, and his entire social standing in the elite community. He actually had the sheer audacity to beg me to show him some mercy, claiming we were both grandfathers who just wanted to protect our respective families. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of his words was absolutely sickening to listen to. I leaned down closer to his sweating face. I reminded him that he had shown absolutely zero mercy to my son this morning when he fired him and humiliated him in front of an entire boardroom of executives. I reminded him that he had shown zero mercy to my 6-year-old grandson when he sent 2 armed strangers to rip the boy from my quiet suburban home. Suddenly, a surge of feral, desperate panic completely took over his body. The self-preservation instinct of a drowning man kicked in. He lunged aggressively across the wide dining table, his hands blindly clawing at the white linen, trying desperately to grab up the small silver flash drive sitting near the center. He knocked over expensive crystal wine glasses, shattering them violently against the heavy silver plates. Red wine spilled across the table like fresh blood. He honestly thought if he could just destroy that tiny physical piece of metal, he could miraculously erase the undeniable evidence of his massive federal crimes. Before his trembling fingers could even brush the silver drive, Matthew stepped forward and firmly planted his hand onto Carlton's shoulder, shoving him incredibly hard back into his velvet chair. Matthew stood tall over his former boss and told him the drive sitting on the table was just a simple digital copy. Matthew informed him with absolute cold precision that multiple encrypted backups of the financial server logs were already sitting safely inside the Bennett Equities legal vaults, spread across 3 different states. Carlton's physical body completely gave out upon hearing that undeniable truth. He slumped back into the velvet chair, covering his face with his shaking hands, and began to sob loudly like a broken, terrified child. The grand illusion of the untouchable billionaire was completely dead and permanently buried. I stood perfectly still and let him cry for a few long, agonizing moments. Then I delivered the final and most important condition of his total defeat. I told Carlton that his expensive lawyers were going to sign the uncontested custody agreement, granting Matthew full physical and legal control of Leo immediately. I instructed him to tell his daughter Rachel to pack her designer bags and leave my son's house before midnight tonight. I made it absolutely clear that if he attempted to delay the corporate resignation, if he tried to hide a single share of his equity in an offshore account, or if Rachel tried to fight the divorce in family court, I would personally hand the server logs directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told him I would hire the absolute best corporate prosecutors in the country to ensure he spent his remaining decades locked inside a dark concrete cell, eating off a metal tray. I asked him if he fully understood the terms of his absolute surrender. Carlton did not speak. He just slowly nodded his head, tears streaming down his face, completely broken and entirely defeated. The heavy silence in the room was finally broken by the sharp sound of Stephen Gallagher closing his leather briefcase. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and pressed a single button. He looked down at Carlton Pierce and told him that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been waiting in the country club parking lot for the last 20 minutes. Stephen had already provided them with a fully authenticated digital copy of the embezzlement logs before we even walked into the building. Carlton did not try to run. He did not have the physical strength left to even stand up from his chair. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors opened for the final time. 4 federal agents wearing dark suits and serious expressions walked into the private dining room. They approached Carlton and read him his rights in a flat, clinical tone. The billionaire did not say a single word as they pulled his arms behind his back and locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp, metallic click echoed against the mahogany walls, signaling the absolute end of the Pierce manufacturing dynasty. The agents pulled him up to his feet and began to lead him out of the room. I watched Rachel as her father was marched right past her. She did not reach out to comfort him. She just stood there, clutching the white divorce envelope tightly against her chest, trembling violently as she realized she was watching her entire source of funding walk out the door in chains. She was left completely alone in the middle of a rented velvet room with absolutely no money, no family, and no future. We did not stay to watch the country club manager panic over the massive unpaid dinner bill. Matthew and I walked out of the room down the grand marble staircase and out the front doors into the cool evening air. We climbed back into my rusted 2004 Ford truck. I started the loud, heavy engine, and we drove away, leaving the luxurious world of fake power completely behind us. The transition back to reality happened with incredible speed over the next few weeks. Carlton was denied bail due to the overwhelming evidence of his federal crimes and his massive offshore flight risk. He was transferred directly to a federal holding facility to await a trial he could never possibly win. True to my word, I forced the immediate transfer of his corporate equity directly into the employee pension fund. The hard-working men and women of the factory received every single penny of their stolen retirement savings back with significant interest. Matthew stepped in as the temporary chief executive officer to stabilize the company and honor the commercial contracts. He did not do it from a glass corner office. He put on his steel-toed boots and spent his days walking the factory floor, talking directly to the workers he had always respected. Rachel signed the divorce papers exactly as Matthew demanded. She tried to move into a cheap apartment downtown, but without her trust fund, she quickly learned how completely useless her entitled attitude was in the real world. She sees my grandson for exactly 4 hours every other Saturday, under the strict supervision of a court-appointed monitor. The true victory did not happen in the courtroom or the corporate boardroom. It happened on a sunny Tuesday afternoon right in my own front yard. I was standing on the small concrete porch of my modest suburban home holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. I looked out at the driveway. The ugly metal for sale sign that Rachel had threatened me with in her mind was completely destroyed. In its place stood my son and my grandson. Matthew had bought a cheap rubber baseball and 2 worn leather gloves from a local sporting goods store. He was teaching Leo how to throw a proper curveball. The boy laughed loudly as the ball bounced harmlessly off the concrete and rolled under my old classic car in the garage. Matthew ran over and scooped the boy up into a massive hug, spinning him around in the warm afternoon air. There was no designer luggage in sight. There were no expensive Italian suits. There was only the pure, unfiltered joy of a father who had finally reclaimed his absolute right to be a father. I took a slow sip of my coffee and felt a profound sense of peace settle deep into my bones. People often confuse noise with power. They believe that the man who yells the loudest, drives the most expensive car, or wears the most expensive watch is the one who controls the world. They think that showing off your wealth is the only way to demand respect. But true power is absolutely silent. It does not need to boast or scream or humiliate others to prove its existence. True power is the quiet patience of a man who knows exactly who he is and what he is capable of. It is the ability to absorb a vicious blow, smile politely, and then completely dismantle your enemy from the inside out, using nothing but the absolute truth. I had spent my entire life building an empire in the shadows, not out of fear, but out of a deep understanding that the most dangerous weapon you can possess is being completely underestimated. Carlton Pierce looked at me and saw a dirty mechanic. He saw a peasant he could easily crush under his expensive shoes. He never realized until it was far too late that the peasant actually owned the very ground he was standing on. If you have ever been looked down upon by arrogant people who think their money makes them better than you, just remember my story. Do not waste your energy screaming back at them. Let them believe their own grand illusions. Let them think you are weak. Keep your head down, do the hard work, and quietly build your own strength in the dark. Because when the time finally comes to balance the scales, the loudest people are always the easiest ones to break. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I hope it brought you some comfort and a deep sense of justice. Let me know what you thought about Carlton's downfall in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories where the quiet ones finally win. Keep your hearts strong and your minds sharp. I will see you all in the very next story.